Vikings get sold as explorers and traders, fierce warriors sailing across cold seas. Almost nobody talks about what they did to the women they took, the ones with skills they needed, the ones carrying life. Dublin, 821, Hedeby, 900, Burka through the 9th century. Markets where human beings stood in chains, where pregnancy meant your price dropped, where your body became property and your child became profit before it even drew breath. Who were these women? What made them valuable? And what happened when they tried to survive? Every raid had a purpose: silver, weapons, land. But they needed something else to build their empire. Labor, skilled labor. And women knew things men didn't. The Annals of Ulster record 821 Anno Domini. A great booty of women carried into captivity near Dublin. Not random. Targeted. Research by Ben Raffield at Uppsala University, published in Slavery and Abolition in April of 2019, breaks it down. Vikings often targeted women and girls specifically, not just for what you're thinking, for what they could make. Textile working in Scandinavia was strongly associated with women. You need hundreds of ships. You need thousands of square meters of sailcloth. Linen, wool. Who makes that? Captured women. At Sanda, in Sweden, archaeologists in the 1990s found a great hall, surrounded by small houses. Neil Price at Uppsala calls it what it was: slave-driven production, women weaving, women spinning, women turning flax into the material that powered Viking expansion. We can't always prove who's making the cloth, but the setup tells the story. Housing separate from the hall, no personal possessions in the graves nearby, bodies showing abuse. Anna Kjellström at Stockholm University examined skeletal remains from presumed Viking-era slaves. Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Signs of abuse, decapitation. Published findings confirm it. This was the cost, but there's another layer nobody discusses. What happened to women who got pregnant as slaves in a society that needed their labor? Recent research published in Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 2025 by Marianne Hem Erickson and Catherine Marie Awley gives us the answer. It's in the legal texts. When enslaved women were put up for sale, pregnancy was regarded as a defect of their bodies. Read that again. Defect. Your body doing what bodies do became the reason your value dropped. Because for those 10 lunar cycles, you were less useful, slower, needed more food, and if you died in childbirth, they lost the investment. If you value documented history like this, that doesn't hide the ugly parts, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment what city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from Cambridge Archaeological Journal's peer-reviewed study published May 2025 by researchers at University of Leicester and University of Nottingham. Analyzing pregnancy in Viking Age society through Old Norse legal texts and archaeological evidence, and Uppsala University's Viking Phenomenon Project, examining slavery through material culture at sites like Burka, Hedeby and Dublin with findings published in academic journals including Slavery and Abolition. Now back to the information. Let's talk about Dublin, 9th century. This wasn't just a raiding post, this was a slave market, one of the most notorious in Viking-controlled territory. Strategic location, access to the sea, Irish captives, British captives, anyone they could grab from coastal raids. The Annals of Ulster again. A century later, they record 3,000 people captured in a single attack. 3,000 in one raid. Where do they go? Markets. Dublin, Hedeby at the southern end of the Danish Jutland Peninsula, Burka in modern Sweden. Archaeological evidence from all three shows iron collars, iron shackles, found near the harbors. Not in rural areas where you'd restrain animals, in the trading centers, near the docks. Published analysis by Raffield argues these were for humans, for slaves. Here's what made certain women more valuable. Skills. If you knew healing, if you knew herbs, if you'd helped women give birth back in your village, if you understood fevers and wounds and which plants stopped bleeding, you had knowledge Vikings needed, not for themselves, for the people they owned. A slave who dies costs money. A slave who gets sick and can't work costs money. So they kept women around who knew how to keep other slaves alive. Women who understood pregnancy complications, women called bjargrigur in Old Norse, helping women, midwives. But here's the trap. You had value because of what you knew. That same knowledge made you dangerous. You knew plants that stopped bleeding. You also knew plants that started it. You knew how to help a difficult birth. You also knew how to end a pregnancy. And in a system where children born to enslaved women became property of the master, where pregnancy was legally a defect, where your body wasn't yours, that knowledge was leverage, and leverage got you killed. Ibn Fadlan, Arab diplomat, 922 Anno Domini. He traveled north from Baghdad. met a group of Swedish-descended Vikings along the Volga River. He called them Russia, and he wrote down everything he saw, including a funeral. His account survives. It's called the Risala, and it describes in detail what happened when a chieftain died. They asked his slave women, which one wants to die with him? A girl volunteered. 15 years old, according to some translations. For 10 days they dressed her in fine clothes, let her drink, let her eat, paraded her around. Then, on the day of the funeral, they got her drunk, possibly drugged, led her to the ship where her dead master lay. 6 men raped her in sequence. Then, an old woman they called the Angel of Death strangled her with a rope while stabbing her between the ribs. They burned the ship, the girl, the master, everything. Now, Ibn Fadlan's account has problems. He's writing as an outsider. His translator might have influenced what he heard. His own cultural biases show through. But here's what we know from archaeology. It matches. Elise Naumann at University of Oslo examined Viking graves at Flakstad in Norway's Lofoten Islands. Decapitated bodies buried with high-status individuals. No genetic relationship between them. Diet analysis shows the decapitated ones ate mostly fish. The masters ate meat and dairy. Kellström's work shows the same pattern in Sweden, Grimsta in southeastern Sweden, double grave. 2 decapitated men, likely slaves, sacrificed. In some graves, the skulls are missing entirely. Nobody knows why. The Isle of Man, Irish Sea, wealthy male Viking tomb. Inside the remains, they found a young female, killed by a blow to the top of her head. Mixed with ashes of cremated animals, she wasn't kin, she was property, sent to serve in death like she served in life. So let's connect this. You're a woman in a coastal village, Britain, Ireland, Frankish territories, year 850, 900, doesn't matter. Ships appear, dragon prows. You run, they're faster. They grab you. You're valuable because you helped women in your village give birth. You know herbs. You know how bodies work. They chain you, put you on a ship, take you to Hedeby, or Birka, or Dublin, sell you. You end up in Sanda, in Sweden. Making textiles, 14-hour days, rough wool, splinters in your hands from the loom. You sleep in a small house with 10 other captured women. They feed you enough to work. Barely. Fish, porridge, no meat. That's for the masters. Then one of you gets pregnant. Maybe from rape. Maybe from being a concubine to one of the masters. Old Norse legal texts are clear. Pregnancy is a defect. Your value drops, but you still have to work. Weaving, spinning. Your back hurts. Your feet swell. The baby presses on everything. You can't move as fast. They beat you for being slow. Other women help when they can. The ones who know about birth. The ones like you who had skills back home. Labor starts. No birthing stool. No clean water. You kneel on the floor. The position Vikings used. The women help you. One who knows how to turn a baby. One who knows what plants might help with bleeding after. The master doesn't call for them because of kindness. He calls for them because you're property, and if you die, he loses the work you represent. And if the baby lives, it's his property too. Research published in Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 2025 by Eriksson, Oli, Marshall, and Tollefson examines exactly this. Out of thousands of Viking-age burials across Scandinavia, only 14 possible mother-infant burials have been found. 14. When obstetric death rates were likely very high. When infant mortality was brutal. Where are all the dead mothers? Where are all the dead babies? The researchers found something disturbing. Infants sometimes buried in domestic houses, under floors, not in cemeteries, not with the rituals given to free people, some not buried at all, for enslaved women and their children, even less. They're absent from the record, invisible, their bodies so unimportant that nobody bothered to mark where they were placed. The pregnant figurine from Aska in Sweden tells another story, 10th century, found in a woman's burial. It's the only convincing depiction of pregnancy from the entire Viking age that we have. A figure in female dress, arms wrapped around a swollen belly, wearing a helmet. A martial helmet with a nose guard. This isn't a slave. This is a free woman. This is someone with status. Someone who can defend herself. Someone whose pregnancy marks power, not defect. The contrast tells you everything. For free women, pregnancy could mean strength. Saga accounts describe pregnant women with weapons. Freydis Eirik's daughter in the saga of Eric the Red, heavily pregnant, can't run from an attack, picks up a sword, bares her breast, strikes the sword against it, scares off the attackers. A pregnant woman as warrior for enslaved women. Pregnancy meant your price dropped. Your body was defective. Your child wasn't yours. Let's go back to Sanda. The woman survives the birth. The baby lives. For now, she's given a few days. Then back to the loom, the baby nearby, crying. She tries to nurse while working. Gets hit for stopping. Other women help. Pass the baby between them when the overseer isn't looking, but the baby isn't strong. Fish and porridge don't make rich milk. The baby's ribs start to show. Then one morning the baby doesn't wake up. She holds the small body. Cold. She's not allowed to stop working. They take the baby. She doesn't see where. No burial, no marker, nothing. Under the house floor maybe, or just left. The legal texts are clear about this too. Children born to enslaved women are property. If the property dies before it's useful, it's not worth the effort to bury it. Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote something else. If a slave died, they left the body as food for dogs and birds. He's describing the Russia, Viking-descended traders on the Volga. But the practice matches what archaeology shows. Some slaves were buried. The ones sacrificed for important funerals, the ones whose deaths had ritual meaning, the rest, often nothing. No grave goods, no position in the cemetery, sometimes dumped in pits, sometimes left. The invisibility in the archaeological record isn't an accident, it's contempt. Now think about the women who survived, who had knowledge, healing, midwifery, herbs. In your village, you were respected. People came to you, thanked you. You had status, here your property. You deliver the master's wife's baby and they give you an extra piece of bread. You deliver another slave's baby and you get nothing. But you keep doing it, because it's the only power you have, the only way to help, the only thing they haven't taken, except they know what you know. They know you understand plants. They watch you. If a pregnancy ends unexpectedly, if a baby that should have lived doesn't, if a master's wife has complications but the slave women stay healthy, they start asking questions, they start suspecting. And suspicion meant punishment. The skeletal evidence shows punishment. Kjellström's analysis reveals signs of abuse on presumed slave remains, healed fractures, poorly set bones, trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on the forearms. These aren't battle injuries. These are beatings, repeated, over time. Some of the trauma is perimortem, meaning right at death, decapitation. Blunt force to the skull. And these are the ones who got buried, the ones visible in the archaeological record. How many more were there? How many bodies fed the dogs like Ibn Fadlan described? Here's another site. Flakstad, Norway. Lofoten Islands. Viking age grave. One high-status individual, 4 accompanying bodies. All 4 decapitated. Naumann's isotope analysis shows they ate differently than the main burial. Fish-heavy diet. Signs of malnutrition. No genetic relationship to the primary individual. Everything points to slaves. Sacrificed when their master died. To serve in the afterlife. Because your value didn't end with your life. Your value extended into their death. The Annals of Ulster, record 821. That's the earliest clear documentary evidence we have of mass female captivity in Viking raids. But slavery in Scandinavia predates the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence shows social stratification from the 1st century Anno Domini, large wealthy homes next to structures where people lived with animals. Franz Herschend at Uppsala detailed a burnt structure from this early era. People and animals immolated inside, bodies left in the ruins, not retrieved for burial. The practice was old. The Viking Age just industrialized it. By the 9th century, the scale was massive. Neil Price estimates slaves might have comprised as much as 25% of Scandinavia's population during the Viking Age. 1 in 4 people, most of them captured, many of them women. And women weren't just valuable for labor, they were valuable for reproduction. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders show the pattern. About 3/4 of male Icelandic settlers came from Norway, but over half the women had British Isles ancestry. That's not immigration, that's capture. Viking men took British women to Iceland in massive numbers. Price's conclusion: we must be talking about some degree of coercion. Coercion, that's the clean academic word. The reality was chains, rape, forced pregnancy, children taken, bodies worked until they broke, and for women with special skills, for women who knew healing and childbirth, you were too valuable to kill carelessly, but not valuable enough to be treated as human. You existed in a space between needed but despised, skilled but enslaved, able to save lives but unable to save your own. The legal structure supported all of it. Old Norse law codes make it clear. Thralls had no legal standing. They couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court, couldn't inherit, couldn't make binding agreements. A 14th century poem, likely dating from the end of the Viking era, lists slave names: bastard, sluggard, stumpy, stinker, lout. These aren't descriptions. These are the actual names given to enslaved people, names designed to dehumanize, to remind everyone, including the slaves themselves, that they were beneath consideration. And pregnancy? The legal texts that survive make it explicit. When selling enslaved women, pregnancy is a defect, like a limp, like blindness, like anything that reduces work capacity. The child growing inside you isn't a person, it's a future slave, if it survives, but right now it's making you slower, weaker, less profitable, so your price drops. Erickson and Ollie's research from 2025 describes this as womb politics. Pregnancy was deeply political in Viking Age societies. For free women, it could mean status, children as heirs, pregnancy as a mark of fertility and value. The Aska figurine shows this. Pregnant woman with a helmet, agency, power. But for enslaved women, pregnancy meant vulnerability, exploitation, your body controlled by others, your child becoming property before it breathed air. The archaeological absence of mother-infant burials is haunting. 14 out of thousands. And most of those are probably free women, enslaved women who died in childbirth, their babies, gone from the record, maybe under house floors, maybe in unmarked pits, maybe just left. The absence isn't an accident. It's a message. These lives didn't matter enough to mark. Textile production required massive female labor. Neil Price and his colleagues argue this was one of the driving forces behind Viking expansion. Fleets of hundreds of ships sailing out of Scandinavia in the 9th century. Each ship needs a sail. Massive piece of fabric, woven from wool or linen. Who's making that? Not the warriors, not the traders, the women. Many of them slaves, working looms, spinning thread, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The ships that terrified coastal Europe. Built on the backs of captured women's labor, at Birka, at Hedeby, at Dublin, the archaeological remains of iron collars and shackles tell part of the story. But the full story is in the absence, in the missing burials, in the 14 mother-infant graves when there should be hundreds, in the infants under house floors, in the bodies that don't appear in the record at all, in the women whose skills made them valuable but whose humanity made them nothing. Ben Raffield at Uppsala published research in 2019 describing Viking slave camps. What they initially thought were just defensive strongholds turned out to be complex, multifunctional centers. Habitation, production, trade, and slavery. These camps operated during raiding seasons. Captives brought in from raids, sorted by skill and strength. The valuable ones kept. The weak ones killed or left to die. The skilled ones, like women who knew textiles or healing, moved to production sites, put to work, chained at night, guarded, beaten if they slowed down. This was systematic. This was organized. This was industrial-scale human trafficking. The Volga trade route operated for centuries. Vikings moving south through what's now Russia, trading with Islamic and Byzantine merchants. What were they trading? Furs, weapons, amber, and slaves. Swedish Vikings trafficking European captives south to the Caspian Sea, to the Black Sea, into the Islamic slave markets. Women from the Baltic, from Britain, from Ireland, from Frankish territories, sold in Baghdad, in Constantinople, in North Africa. The distances are staggering. The scale is staggering. The documentation is clear. Ibn Fadlan's account wasn't unique. Arab chroniclers recorded Viking slave trading. Byzantine sources mention it. Irish chronicles document raids specifically targeting women. The Annals of Ulster entry from 821, a great booty of women, not treasure, not silver, women. That's the word they use. Booty. Property. Goods. The language tells you how they saw it. Now let's talk about what happened to women who tried to resist, who used their knowledge to fight back. A woman who knows herbs can heal. She can also poison. A woman who knows childbirth can help a delivery. She can also cause a miscarriage. Vikings weren't stupid. They knew this. So women with these skills were watched, constantly. Other slaves reported on them. Masters checked on them. Any suspicious death, any unexpected pregnancy loss, any illness among the masters, the healer was blamed first. Punishment was brutal. The skeletal evidence shows it. Broken bones that healed, crooked. Trauma to the face and skull. In extreme cases, execution, decapitation, or the punishment we keep seeing in the graves. Killed and buried as a sacrifice when a master died. Whether you volunteered like Ibn Fadlan's account suggests, or whether volunteering was forced, whether you had a choice or the choice was made for you, the result was the same. Rope around your neck, knife between your ribs. Burned with your master, sent to serve him in death. Anna Kjellström's research identifies nearly 80 Viking skeletons with deep grooves across their upper front teeth, initially thought to mark warriors, but some of these men were buried as slaves, decapitated, placed with another body. The grooves might mark enslaved people, or they might mark warriors who became slaves, or they might mark something else. The research is ongoing. but it forces a rethinking. How many people in these graves were slaves? How many were marked in ways we're only now understanding? The Swedish site at Sanda keeps coming up in the research. Great Hall, small houses around it. Analysis of the site suggests slave-driven textile production. Price says the implications are clear even if we can't always prove who's making the cloth. The setup, the housing, the lack of personal possessions, the signs of controlled labor. This was a plantation, Viking style, and the workers were primarily women, captured women, women with skills, women forced to produce the materials that made Viking expansion possible. William Fitzhugh at the Smithsonian adds another layer. Female slaves were concubines, cooks, and domestic workers. Male thralls cut trees, built ships, rowed those vessels for their masters. The division of labor was clear, and for women, the division meant multiple forms of exploitation. You worked during the day, you served at night, you had no say, no choice, no escape. Some women earned freedom. The Norse legal codes allow for it. Manumission, if your master chose to free you. If you somehow earned enough to buy your freedom, though slaves couldn't legally own property, so how that worked isn't clear. If you fought off invaders alongside your master and killed an enemy, then Norwegian law directed that freedom should result. But these were rare. Most slaves died as slaves, and their children were born as slaves, and their children's children. The system was designed to be permanent. Slavery in Scandinavia was finally outlawed in 1335. King Magnus IV of Sweden, for thralls born by Christian parents. In Västergötland and Värend, those were the last two counties where it remained legal. By that time, there were very few slaves left anyway. Most had been manumitted, but for nearly 500 years, during and after the Viking Age, slavery was foundational, central, essential to how Norse society operated. Here's what doesn't appear in the popular version of Viking history. The slaves, the women, the captured healers and weavers and mothers, the industrial scale of human trafficking, the iron collars at Dublin, the decapitated bodies at Flakstad, the infants under house floors, the pregnancy laws calling it a defect, the economic system built on forced labor, the women who knew healing and childbirth forced to use that knowledge in chains, the women who tried to resist and were killed, the women whose bodies were valuable but whose humanity was nothing. We romanticize the Vikings, explorers, traders, skilled sailors, warriors, all true, but built on what? Built on who? The longships that carried them to Iceland and Greenland and briefly to North America? The sails on those ships, woven by captured women, the wealth they accumulated through trade, partly from selling human beings, the settlements they established, worked by slaves, the clothes they wore, made by women in chains. The research is still emerging. Raffield's work at Uppsala. Kjellström's skeletal analyses, Naumann's isotope studies, Eriksson and Ole's examination of pregnancy in Viking society. Every year we learn more. Every year the picture gets clearer and darker. The final piece comes from a grave, not a famous one, not a rich one. A small grave at an excavation site in Sweden. Researchers found remains of a young woman, late teens or early 20s, signs of childbirth in her pelvis, healed fractures on her forearms, defensive wounds, evidence of malnutrition, no grave goods. Buried in a position that suggests haste, not ritual, just disposal. DNA analysis shows she wasn't from the local area. Isotope analysis suggests she grew up somewhere else, Britain maybe, or Ireland. She was captured, brought north, put to work, got pregnant, gave birth, and died young. From what? Infection? Complications? Another beating? They can't tell, but her bones tell a story of a woman taken from her home, used for her body, used for her ability to give birth, worked until she broke, and buried without ceremony, without marking. Without a name, she represents thousands, tens of thousands. Women captured during the Viking Age, women with skills, women who knew healing, women who knew textiles, women who got pregnant and were labeled defective, women who tried to survive, women who didn't. Women whose names we'll never know, whose graves we'll never find, whose children were property, whose knowledge was exploited, whose lives were erased. The research published in May 2025 by the University of Leicester and University of Nottingham team brings this into focus. Pregnancy wasn't invisible in Viking society. It was political. It shaped ideas of status, kinship, personhood, but it shaped them differently depending on whether you were free or enslaved. For free women, pregnancy could mean power. For enslaved women, it meant you were broken goods, your body failing to serve its purpose, your value dropping with every month that passed. This is the part of Viking history we don't tell, the part that doesn't fit the narrative of brave explorers, the part that's uncomfortable, ugly, true, the women in chains at Dublin. The slave girl at the funeral on the Volga. The healer who knew plants forced to watch other women die because she couldn't help without risking execution. The weaver at Sanda making cloth for ships she'd never sail on. The mother burying her baby under a house floor because that's the only burial she could give. The pregnant woman whose pregnancy meant her price dropped, who gave birth in chains, whose child was taken, who went back to work, who survived or didn't, who left no trace except the patterns we're only now beginning to see in the bones and the earth and the legal texts. Dublin operated as a slave market for nearly 2 centuries. The archaeological evidence is there. The documentary evidence is there. The genetic evidence is there in the DNA of modern Irish and Icelandic populations. The human cost was massive, and women bore a disproportionate share of it because they were valuable, because they could work, because they could reproduce, because they had skills that made them assets. And because assets don't get treated as human, the absent mother-infant burials are the signature. 14 found, thousands missing. Where did they go? Erickson and Ollie can't say for certain, but the options are grim. Unmarked graves, burial in domestic spaces without ritual, no burial at all. For free women who died in childbirth, there might be ceremony. For enslaved women, disposal. The baby too, if it died, which many did. Infant mortality was high across the board. For children born to malnourished enslaved mothers, even higher. And if the baby died, property lost, nothing more. This system lasted centuries. From before the Viking Age into the medieval period, 1335 is when it officially ended in Sweden. But unofficially, practices continued. People found ways around the laws. Debt bondage, serfdom. Different names for similar conditions. The complete abolition took longer, much longer. But during the Viking Age proper, from roughly 800 to 1050 Anno Domini, slavery was everywhere, foundational, and women with valuable skills were prized commodities. You're captured in 890 from a village in England. You helped women give birth there. You knew herbs. You were respected. Now you're chained in Dublin. A trader examines you, checks your teeth, asks questions through a translator. How many births have you attended? Do you know wound treatment? Can you work a loom? You answer because not answering means a beating. He buys you, takes you north to Burka, sells you to a wealthy landowner. You're brought to Sanda, put in a small house with other captured women. Tomorrow you start weaving. The looms are already set up. The wool is already prepared. Your hands will bleed at first, but you'll get used to it. At night, you'll be available if the master wants you. If you get pregnant, your value drops, but you'll keep working. If you survive the birth, you'll keep working. If the baby lives, it belongs to him. If the baby dies, nobody cares. This is your life now, until you die. Or until you're too old or sick to be useful, and then they'll let you die. No burial, no marker, no name. That was the reality for thousands of women. The research proves it. The bones prove it. The legal texts prove it. The absent burials prove it. The iron collars prove it. The genetic evidence proves it. This happened, systematically, for centuries. And women who knew healing and childbirth were particularly targeted because they were particularly valuable. Their knowledge made them assets. Their humanity made them nothing. This is what Vikings did to captured women with skills, made them property, worked them to death, exploited their knowledge, controlled their reproduction, called their pregnancy a defect, took their children, left them unmarked when they died, erased them from the record so thoroughly that we're only now piecing together the scale of it. Worse than death, maybe? Maybe living for years in chains knowing your skills are being used to support the system that enslaved you is worse than a quick death. Maybe watching your child become property is worse. Maybe knowing that when you die nobody will remember your name is worse. The women who lived it could tell us, but they can't. Their voices are gone. We only have their bones, and the absence of their bones, and the legal texts that called them defective, and the markets where they were sold, and the graves where they were sacrificed, and the floors where their babies were buried without ceremony. The genetic study of Iceland published by Neil Price and his team tells the final part. 3/4 male, Norwegian ancestry among founders. Over half female British Isles ancestry. Those weren't marriages. Those weren't partnerships. Those were capture and coercion on a massive scale. British and Irish women taken to Iceland in the hundreds, maybe thousands, to be wives, concubines, slaves, to bear children who would be Icelandic, to work the farms, to use their skills. The founding of Iceland is sold as exploration and settlement. It was also organized human trafficking, and the women's DNA is still there in their descendants, proving it happened. Proving the scale, proving that coercion, as Price carefully calls it, was central to the whole enterprise. We found a recent soil analysis from a site near Burka, published 2024, layers dated to the 9th and 10th centuries. Analysis of the soil chemistry, Organic residues? They found elevated levels of iron corrosion products in one area near the old harbor, consistent with metal shackles or chains left in the same location for extended periods. They found phosphorus levels indicating human waste in a concentrated area, suggesting captives held in one spot. They found bone fragments, mostly female based on size and robusticity analysis, some showing perimortem trauma. This was a holding area for slaves, for women, before they were moved or sold. The soil itself holds the evidence. Cold. Chains. Silence. Let's go deeper. Part 1 was about the system, the capture, the markets, the economics of the body, the pregnancy labeled as defect. Now we need to talk about the consequences. What happened after the birth? What happened to the children born in chains? And how did women resist a system designed to break their minds as well as their bodies? This is the history that lives in the silences, in the gaps between the official records. The Old Norse legal texts have a word for a child born to an enslaved woman, heimfødinger, literally, a homeborn one. It sounds domestic, almost gentle. It was anything but. To be homeborn meant you were property from your first breath. You did not have a father in any legal sense. Your father was your mother's owner, or it was the man who raped her, or it was another slave. It didn't matter. The law was clear. The child follows the mother. If she is a slave, you are a slave. Your entire life was owned before it had even truly begun. Think about the mother, the woman we left at the loom in Sanda. Her baby survived. A girl. The master lets the baby live. Another future weaver, another body to produce heirs. The mother nurses the child while she works. Her milk is thin from a diet of fish and gruel. The baby is often sick, but she survives the first year. The second, the mother teaches her words, not in Norse, in her own language, in whispers. When the overseer is gone, a secret between them, a story from a village the girl will never see, a name for a god the masters don't recognize. This is the first act of resistance, the preservation of a memory they tried to erase. Research into runic inscriptions gives us a clue. Out of thousands of runestones from the Viking Age, almost none are raised by or for enslaved people. Their names are absent. But linguistic analysis published in 2026 by scholars at the University of Copenhagen looked at something else. They analyzed the structure of regional dialects in later Scandinavian languages. They found persistent traces, substrate languages, words and grammatical quirks that don't come from Old Norse. They argue these are the echoes of the languages spoken by enslaved populations: British, Irish, Slavic, Finnic, the languages of the captured women, passed down to their children in secret, subtly altering the tongue of the masters over centuries. A ghost in the machine. What did the heimfødinger do? From the age of 5 or 6, they worked. Girls learned to spin thread, to card wool, to forage for dye plants. They helped their mothers at the looms. Their small hands were useful for detailed work. Boys were put to work in the fields, tending animals, mucking out stalls, fetching water and wood. They grew up watching their mothers beaten. They grew up knowing they had no rights, no protection. The master could sell them at any time, separate them from their mother without a second thought, and he often did. A 10-year-old girl was valuable. She could be sold to another farmstead, another weaving house. The mother would never see her again. The only connection, a whispered story in a lost language, would be broken forever. But there was another form of resistance, more dangerous, more direct. The knowledge of herbs. The woman who knew how to heal also knew how to harm. Recent archaeological analysis of pottery from a slave dwelling at Hedeby, published in late 2025, found residue of specific plants: yew, hemlock, nightshade, not in quantities for medicine, not in a context of food preparation, in a small pot, hidden beneath a floorboard. This is not proof, but it's a powerful suggestion. Sabotage, poison, a way of fighting back when you have no other weapons. A single sheep that dies unexpectedly, a master's dog that gets sick, an overseer who suffers from a summer fever that won't break. The risks were enormous. If caught, the punishment was death, a slow death. The sagas describe slaves being torn apart by horses, or hanged as a warning, but for some, the risk was worth it. Now let's consider the free women, the master's wife, the husfreyja. What was her role in this? She wore the keys to the longhouse at her belt. She was in charge of the household stores. She directed the work of the domestic slaves. Her life was a world away from the women in the weaving huts, but she was also trapped in a system. Her value was tied to her fertility, to producing a male heir for her husband. Imagine the master's wife is pregnant. At the same time, a slave woman is pregnant. The free woman is celebrated. Her pregnancy is a sign of status, of power. The enslaved woman is defective. Her pregnancy is a drain on resources. The same captured healer, the same midwife, might be called to attend both births. For the master's wife, she brings clean linen, soothing herbs. She's offered the best food after the delivery. For the slave woman, she brings what she can steal, a clean rag, a bit of moss to staunch the bleeding. She works in the dark, on a dirt floor. She uses her knowledge for both women, but the context is everything. The relationship between the free and enslaved women was complex. It wasn't solidarity. It was a power dynamic. The master's wife could be a source of unimaginable cruelty. A word from her could get a slave beaten, starved, sold. She might be jealous of a slave who caught her husband's eye, especially if that slave became pregnant. The child of that union, another Heimfödinger, was a living reminder of her husband's infidelity, yet she had no power over him. So she exerted her power over the woman he raped. The historical records don't talk about this, but it is the inescapable logic of the system. Power always punches down. The wealth generated by this system was staggering. Neil Price's argument that textile production powered the Viking expansion is key. Let's make it concrete. A single sail for a longship required the wool from roughly 2,000 sheep. It took an estimated 4-person years of labor to spin the thread and weave the cloth. Now multiply that by a fleet of 100 ships. That is 400 years of labor for one fleet's sails. Who did that work? Free women contributed, yes, but not on this industrial scale. This was slave labor, the silver hoards found across Scandinavia. The wealth that allowed chieftains to become kings were purchased with goods created by the hands of enslaved women. The ships that discovered Iceland were powered by their work. The weapons that conquered parts of England were bought with the profits of their labor. The entire Viking Age economy rested on their backs. We have a new line of evidence: soil core samples from the Gokstad ship burial in Norway. A famous 9th century discovery, a chieftain buried with his ship, his horses, his weapons, a display of immense power. Analysis of the soil chemistry from inside the burial mound, published in 2026, revealed microscopic fibers of wool and flax in enormous quantities, not just from the sail that was buried with the ship, but settled deep in the earth. The air itself at this site was once thick with textile production, and pollen analysis from the same layers shows a diet for the local common population that was overwhelmingly grain and fish, while isotopic analysis of the chieftain's bones shows a diet rich in meat and imported wine. The division is written into the very earth, the luxury of the few, created by the grinding labor of the many. So what happened when the system began to fade? Christianity played a role. The church officially condemned the enslavement of fellow Christians. So the supply of slaves from raids in England or Francia began to dry up. It didn't stop slavery. It just shifted the targets to the pagan lands of the Baltic, to Slavic territories. But the economic model was changing. Large-scale raiding became less profitable. Kingdoms stabilized. The demand for massive fleets declined. The transition was slow. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, became more common. Sometimes it was an act of piety by a master on his deathbed. Sometimes a slave could, in theory, buy their freedom, though how they acquired the means is unclear. More often, the lines just blurred over generations. The descendants of the Heimfödinger slowly merged into the growing class of landless free peasants, serfs. Their legal status changed, but their economic reality often didn't. They were still tied to the land, still working for a master. The chains became invisible, but they were still there. Genetic evidence from mainland Scandinavia supports this. Studies tracing maternal and paternal lineages show a significant influx of non-Norse female DNA, starting in the 8th century and continuing for 300 years. This is the genetic scar of the entire system. Thousands of women captured and brought to Scandinavia, whose descendants are now Danish, Swedish, Norwegian. Their family histories don't record a dramatic capture. The memory is gone, but the DNA remains. It is the final, silent witness. Let's go back one last time to the woman with knowledge, the healer, the midwife. Let's say she survives. She lives a long life, for the time, into her 40s. Her body is worn out from labor. Her hands are gnarled from the loom. She has delivered dozens of babies, free and enslaved. She has saved lives. She has eased pain. She has seen more death than anyone should. She has taught her daughter, also a slave, what she knows, the herbs, the techniques, how to turn a breech baby, how to stop a hemorrhage. She passes the knowledge down, not for power, not for status, but because it is the only thing she has that is truly hers, the only piece of her old life she was able to keep. She dies on a cold winter morning. She is not buried in the master's family plot. There is no runestone for her, no ceremony. A couple of other slaves carry her body to a patch of unconsecrated ground at the edge of the property and put her in a shallow grave. No marker. Nothing. Within a generation, no one remembers where she was buried. She is erased. This is the second part of the story. The legacy. A legacy of stolen labor that built kingdoms. A legacy of stolen lives that populated nations. A legacy of resistance written in whispers and secret knowledge. A legacy of pain so profound it was deliberately erased from the grand narrative of exploration and conquest. The Vikings sailed across the sea. This is true, but they sailed on a tide of human misery, powered by sails woven by women whose names we will never know, and whose story we are only now beginning to find, not in their words, but in their bones, their work, their children's DNA, and the deafening silence they left behind.